Whispers in the walls. Moving to the countryside was supposed to be a fresh start for us, chance to escape the suffocating chaos of the city. John and I had dreamed of a place where Emily and Jack could run free, where we could build a home that was truly ours. When we first saw the old Victorian house at the edge of the woods, it felt like destiny. It needs a bit of work, the real estate agent had said almost sheepishly as we walked through the dust-filled rooms. But all I could see was potential. The tall ceilings, the intricate woodwork, the sense of history etched into every corner. Sure, it was a bit run-down. That was part of the charm. We could fix it up, make it our own. I was certain of it. "Blair, this place is amazing," John had whispered, his eyes sparkling with the same excitement I felt. I nodded, imagining the laughter of our children echoing through the halls, Christmases by the fireplace, summers in the overgrown garden. We moved in on a crisp autumn day, air sharp, promise of winter. The house welcomed us with open arms, or so I thought. We spent the first week unpacking, settling into the rhythm of our new life. Emily and Jack were thrilled with their new rooms, each one larger than their entire apartment back in the city. They spent hours exploring the house, finding hidden nooks and crannies, their laughter filling the empty spaces. It was on the third night that I first felt it. I had woken up in the middle of the night, the house unnervingly silent. At first I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, but then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Claire." I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "John?" I called out, but he was sound asleep beside me. The whisper came again, this time closer, as if it was right beside me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, the air in the room suddenly thick and oppressive. I reached out to shake John awake. As soon as I touched him, the whisper stopped. The room returned to its normal temperature, and I was left wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I mentioned it to John, but he just smiled and chalked it up to first-night jitters. "It's an old house, Claire. Probably just the wind or the pipes, nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe him, so I did, but deep down, something had shifted in me. The house, which had felt so welcoming, now seemed to be watching us, waiting. As the days passed, the oddities began to pile up. Small things at first, keys disappearing and then reappearing in strange places, doors creaking open on their own, a sudden chill in the air when you least expected it. Emily and Jack didn't seem to notice, too caught up in their new world of make-believe. But I noticed. I noticed everything. One evening, as I was tucking Emily into bed, she looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes of hers and asked, "Mommy, do you know Edward?" I frowned. "Who's Edward, sweetie?" "He's my friend," she said matter-of-factly. "He lives in the house." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean he lives in the house?" "He told me he's been here for a long, long time," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if she was sharing a secret. "He said he doesn't like it when people move into his house." Cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. "Emily, honey, there's no one else living here, just us." She looked at me, her expression serious. "But I've seen him, Mommy. He's really sad, and sometimes he's angry. He told me to tell you we should leave." I forced a smile, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "It's just your imagination, sweetie. There's no such thing as ghosts." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and snuggled under the covers. I kissed her goodnight, my mind racing. Was this just a phase? An imaginary friend brought on by the stress of the move? I wanted to believe that, but something about the way she spoke, so certain, so serious, made it hard to dismiss. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. Every creak, every groan seemed amplified, each one making my heart race a little faster. And then I heard it again, the whisper. "Claire." It was clearer this time, closer. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, but I could feel a presence, something just out of sight, watching me. I wanted to wake John, to tell him what I was hearing. Something stopped me. A feeling deep in my gut that whatever was in the room with me didn't want him to know. It was a warning. Threat. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the whisper didn't come again, and as dawn broke, I was left questioning my own sanity. Was I losing it? Was the stress of the move, the adjustment to a new life, playing tricks on my mind? But as the days turned into weeks, the events in the house escalated. And it wasn't just me anymore. John started noticing things too. Lights flickering, cold drafts, objects moving on their own. He tried to stay rational, to find logical explanations for everything, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Then, one night, everything changed. We were sitting in the living room, the kids already in bed, when we heard a loud crash from upstairs. We both jumped up, my heart in my throat. "Stay here," John said, grabbing a flashlight and heading up the stairs. I followed, unable to stay behind, a growing sense of dread gnawing at me. We reached the top of the stairs, and I could see the light from Emily's room flickering. John pushed the door open, and we both froze. All of Emily's toys were scattered across the floor, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like black soot, were the words, "Leave now." Emily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Mommy, Daddy, Edward's angry." That was the first time I saw John truly afraid. We both stood there, staring at the words on the wall, the reality of our situation sinking in. This wasn't just an old house with creaky floors and drafty windows. Something was in this house with us, something malevolent, and it wanted us gone. But the worst part was, deep down, I knew we couldn't leave. Not yet. Whatever was in this house wouldn't let us go so easily. John and I stood there in silence, staring at the ominous message scrawled on the wall. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. The cold chill that had settled into my bones wouldn't go away. Emily's wide eyes darted between us, her little hands clutching the stuffed rabbit as though it was the only thing keeping her safe. "John, we need to leave," I whispered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. John turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "Where would we go? We can't just run out in the middle of the night. Let's take Emily and Jack to our room. We'll figure it out in the morning." I wanted to argue, to insist that we leave right then and there, but something in the house seemed to press down on me, making me feel heavy and trapped. Just nodded and helped Emily out of bed. We woke Jack up and moved the kids into our room. They didn't complain, didn't question why they were suddenly sleeping with us. They seemed to understand on some instinctual level that something was very wrong. That night, none of us slept. The house was alive with noises. Footsteps above our heads, soft knocks on the walls, and the occasional whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I clung to John, my heart hammering in my chest, praying that morning would bring some clarity, some way out of this nightmare. When dawn finally broke, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. The house, bathed in the soft light of morning, looked almost normal. Almost. The tension lingered, the calm before a storm. John and I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee that neither of us wanted. Kids were still asleep in our bed, exhausted from the sleepless night. "We need to get someone out here," Don said, breaking the silence. "Priest, a medium, I don't know. Someone who can tell us what's going on." I nodded, grateful that he was taking this seriously now. "But who? We don't know anyone like that." John sighed and rubbed his temples. "There's got to be someone. I'll start looking, but in the meantime, we can't stay in that room. I think we should sleep in the living room tonight." I agreed, but the idea of spending another night in this house no matter where filled me with dread. As John began searching online for help, I decided to take another look at the house. There had to be something we were missing, something that could explain what was happening. I started in the basement. It was the one place I had avoided since we moved in, but now I felt a strange pull to explore it. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. A faint smell of damp earth and mildew filled my nostrils, and I had to suppress the urge to turn back. The basement was unfinished, with dirt floors and crumbling stone walls. The only light came from a single bare bulb that cast long, eerie shadows. I ran my fingers along the wall, feeling for anything out of place. After several minutes of searching, my hand brushed against something. A small, wooden panel embedded in the stone. My heart skipped a beat as I pressed on the panel. It gave way with a soft click, revealing a narrow doorway. A gust of icy air rushed out, making me shiver. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the opening, curiosity overriding my fear. The hidden room was small and cramped, with walls covered in strange symbols. In the center of the room was an old wooden table, and on it a large leather-bound book. The book was thick, its pages yellowed with age, and the cover was adorned with a symbol I had seen before. The same symbol that had appeared on the walls upstairs after our last encounter with the poltergeist. I picked up the book, my hands trembling. As I opened it, pages crackled like dead leaves. The writing inside was faded and difficult to read, but it was clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It was a journal, detailing the lives of the previous owners, the ones who had disappeared. They had been a family, just like ours. The father had been a man of science, but his obsession with the occult had led him down a dark path. He had become convinced that the house was a gateway to another realm, a place where spirits lingered, waiting for a chance to return to the world of the living. The journal described how he had conducted rituals in this very room, using his own family as vessels to summon and communicate with these spirits. At first, the rituals had been harmless, simple seances and experiments, but over time, they had grown darker, more dangerous. The man had become desperate, willing to do anything to prove his theories, even if it meant sacrificing his own family. The last entry was unfinished, the writing frantic and erratic. It spoke of something breaking through, something powerful and angry. The final words were scrawled in large, uneven letters. "We cannot leave. It won't let us leave." I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my ears. I stumbled back out of the hidden room, the walls seeming to close in around me. I had to get out of the basement, out of this house. I needed to breathe. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. My blood ran cold as I raced towards the sound, my mind filled with images of what could have happened. When I burst into the kitchen, I found John standing over a broken coffee mug, his face pale as a sheet. "Claire, I found someone," he said, his voice shaking. I barely registered his words, my mind still reeling from what I had just discovered. "John, there's something you need to see," I whispered, pulling him towards the basement. We descended the stairs together, and I led him to the hidden room. His eyes widened as he took in the symbols on the walls and the journal on the table. He opened the book, scanning the pages, his expression growing darker with each word. This is insane," he muttered. "What kind of person does this?" "The kind of person who doesn't care what happens to his family," replied, my voice trembling. "John, we're in serious danger. We need to leave now." John nodded, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. "But we can't just run. If what this book says is true, this thing won't let us go." "Then what do we do?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. John closed the journal and took a deep breath. "The person I found. He's a paranormal investigator. He's dealt with cases like this before. We need to get him here, and we need to figure out how to stop this thing." As much as I hated the idea of staying in the house any longer, I knew John was right. We couldn't leave until we knew we were safe, until we knew this entity was gone for good. We called the investigator, a man named Robert Harding, and explained our situation. He listened patiently, his calm demeanor doing little to soothe my nerves. He agreed to come out that evening, urging us to stay together and avoid interacting with the spirit until he arrived. The hours until his arrival stretched on endlessly. Every creak, every flicker of light set me on edge. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it knew we were planning something and was preparing to fight back. When Robert finally arrived, I was surprised by how ordinary he looked. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind, weathered face. He carried a small black bag filled with equipment, and his presence brought a glimmer of hope to our dire situation. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "I've seen cases like this before. We'll get to the bottom of it." We led him to the basement, showing him the hidden room and the journal. He examined the symbols on the walls, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is old, very old," he murmured. "These symbols, they're meant to trap spirits. But whoever did this didn't know what they were dealing with. They opened a door they couldn't close." He turned to us, his expression serious. "This spirit, this entity, it's powerful, but it's not invincible. It's feeding off your fear, your energy. We need to cut off its source of power and send it back to where it came from. John and I exchanged a nervous glance. How do we do that? John asked. Robert pulled a small vial of salt from his bag. We'll need to create a barrier around the house, one that it can't cross. And we'll need to perform a cleansing ritual to weaken it. But it won't be easy. The entity will fight back, and it will be angry. Despite the fear gnawing at me, I nodded. We're ready to do whatever it takes. Robert gave a curt nod and began preparing the ritual. He instructed us to gather candles, matches, and anything that held sentimental value to us. Objects that represented our family's love and unity. The items would serve as a counterbalance to the darkness in the house. As we worked, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier, the air thick with tension. We could feel the entity's presence, lurking just out of sight, watching us with malevolent intent. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it didn't want us there. Finally, everything was in place. Robert began the ritual, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. He sprinkled salt around the perimeter of the basement, forming a protective circle. The candles flickered as he called upon forces I couldn't understand, his voice steady and unwavering. The house reacted violently. The walls shook, and the floor beneath us trembled. A deafening roar filled the air, and I could feel the entity's rage, its desperation to break free. "Hold on," Robert shouted over the noise. "Don't break the circle, no matter what happened." The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath visible in the freezing air. Shadows swirled around us, dark and menacing, as if the entity was trying to tear us apart. We held our ground, our hands clasped together, our resolve unshaken. Robert's chanting grew louder, more forceful, and I could feel the power of his words pushing back against the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, chaos ceased. The shadows receded, temperature began to rise, and the oppressive presence in the room lifted. The house was still, eerily quiet. "It's done," Robert said, his voice hoarse. "The entity has been weakened, but it's not gone. We've bought ourselves some time, but we need to finish this." "What else do we have to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Robert looked at us, his expression grave. "We need to find the source of its power, the object it's tied to. Somewhere in this house, hidden. Once we find it, we can destroy it and banish the entity for good." A sense of dread settled over me as I realized the enormity of the task ahead. The house was large, filled with countless rooms and hiding places. But I knew we had no choice. We had to find whatever was binding the entity to this place, or we would never be free. The search began immediately. We combed through every inch of the house, examining every object, every crevice. As the hours passed, my fear grew, gnawing at my resolve. What if we couldn't find it? What if it was too late? But then, in the early hours of the morning, we found it. In the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was an old, ornate box. It was heavy, the metal cold to the touch, and I could feel a pulsing energy emanating from it. "This is it," Robert said, his voice filled with certainty. "This is what's binding the entity to this house." He placed the box on the floor and opened it carefully. Inside was a small, withered heart, blackened and shriveled with age. It was wrapped in a strip of cloth, covered in the same symbols that adorned the walls of the hidden room. "The heart of the ritual," Robert explained. "Essence of the entity, trapped and preserved. We need to destroy it." Without hesitation, Robert doused the heart in holy water and set it ablaze. The fire roared to life, burning with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a small object. Flames consumed the heart, turning it to ash, and with it, the last remnants of the entity's power. As the fire died down, a sense of peace settled over the house. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a lightness I hadn't felt since we moved in. It was over. We were free. We left the house that morning, taking only what we needed. I didn't look back as we drove away, the sun rising behind us. I didn't want to see the house, to remember the horrors we had faced there. I just wanted to move on, to start anew. But even as we settled into our new life, far away from that cursed place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a whisper in the dead of night. I would wake up, heart pounding, certain that I wasn't alone. And sometimes just before sleep claimed me, I would hear it again, that soft, insistent whisper. The days that followed our escape from the house were a blur of exhaustion and relief. We found a small, temporary apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the sprawling Victorian we had left behind. But it was safe. Or at least, felt safe. John and I did our best to pretend that life was returning to normal. We enrolled Emily and Jack in a new school, unpacked what few belongings we had brought with us, and tried to settle into a routine. But there was an unspoken tension between us, a shared understanding that no matter how far we had run, something had changed, something we couldn't leave behind. It started with the dreams. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dreams were always the same. I was back in the old house, standing in the dark hallway, the shadows closing in around me. Could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, growing louder and more insistent as I walked through the house. And then, just as I would reach the basement door, I would hear it. A soft, chilling voice calling my name. Claire. The dreams left me shaken, but I tried to brush them off as lingering trauma. We had been through something terrible, something beyond comprehension. It was only natural that it would leave scars on our minds, that our subconscious would replay those fears in our sleep. But then, it started happening while I was awake. One afternoon, as I was unpacking a box in the living room, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, fleeting and indistinct, darting across the room. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat. There was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination. The incident left me feeling uneasy, as if the walls of our new home were hiding something sinister. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a soft knock on the kitchen window. I turned to look, but again, there was nothing there. I stood frozen for a moment, listening, waiting, but the knock didn't come again. I tried to shake off the creeping dread that was settling over me, but it lingered, gnawing at my nerves. The children were the next to notice. "Mommy, I saw Edward today," Emily said one night as I tucked her into bed. My blood ran cold at her words, and I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Sweetie, Edward isn't real. We talked about this, remember? He was just your imagination." Emily frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "But I saw him, Mommy. He was in my room. He said he missed us." My heart pounded in my chest. "Emily, it's just a bad dream. Edward isn't here. Can't be here." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the way she clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest as if seeking protection. Kissed her goodnight, trying to keep my fear at bay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The incidents escalated over the next few days. Strange sounds echoed through the apartment at night, footsteps, whispers, and the occasional knock on the walls. Objects began to move on their own, just like in the old house. Glass would slide across the table, a door would creak open, and lights would flicker without reason. John was the last to admit that something was wrong. He had been trying so hard to hold everything together, keep us grounded in reality, but even he couldn't deny what was happening. Final straw came one night when we were watching TV. The screen flickered, and suddenly the image distorted, replaced by a dark, shadowy figure standing in the center of the living room. The figure was barely distinguishable, just a silhouette against the grainy static, but its presence was unmistakable. "Turn it off, John," I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached for the remote, his hand shaking, and turned off the TV. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment we sat in silence, neither of us daring to move. Then, slowly, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, as if the figure was still there, watching us. "We need to call Robert," John said finally, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Robert had warned us that the entity might not be gone for good, that its influence could linger. But I hadn't imagined it would follow us here, to our new home, our supposed sanctuary. We contacted Robert the next morning. He listened quietly as we described what had been happening, his voice calm and measured when he finally spoke. "It's not uncommon for entities to attach themselves to people rather than places," he explained, "especially if the spirit was particularly strong or if there was a powerful emotional connection." "An emotional connection?" I echoed, my mind racing. "Yes," Robert said. "The entity might have fed off your fear, your trauma, and latched onto you as a source of energy. It could be using those emotions to maintain a foothold in this world. But what do we do? John asked, desperation creeping into his voice. How do we get rid of it for good? There are a few options, Robert said. We can try another cleansing ritual, but this time, we'll need to focus on you and your family rather than the house. It's possible that the entity's attachment is weaker now that its source of power has been destroyed, but it will take time and effort to fully sever the connection. Robert arrived the next day, armed with more tools and rituals. This time, he performed the cleansing directly on us, one by one, using salt, incense, and prayer to protect us from the entity's influence. The ritual was intense, the air heavy with the scent of burning herbs and the sound of Robert's chanting. As the ritual progressed, I felt a strange, heavy pressure lifting from my chest, as if something invisible had been pressing down on me for weeks. But there was also a sense of sadness, a deep, hollow feeling, gnawed at me. It was as if the entity didn't want to let go, as if it was clinging to us with everything it had. When the ritual was complete, Robert instructed us to burn the items that held sentimental value, the ones we had used in the ritual. He explained that by destroying them, we would be severing the final ties between us and the entity. It was a painful process, watching those cherished objects go up in flames. The stuffed rabbit Emily had carried everywhere, the family photo we had brought from the old house, even the wedding ring John had worn for years. But we knew it was necessary, that it was the only way to free ourselves from the entity's grip. For a few days, things seemed to improve. The apartment felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The strange occurrences stopped, and for the first time in weeks, we slept soundly through the night. But the relief was short-lived. One evening, as I was brushing my hair in the bathroom mirror, I saw it. A shadow just behind me, barely visible in the reflection. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned around quickly. The bathroom was empty. I stared at the spot where the shadow had been, my pulse racing. The whisper was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, unmistakable. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the sink, trying to steady myself. This wasn't over. It was never going to be over. I didn't tell John about the shadow, about the whisper. I couldn't bear to shatter the fragile peace we had fought so hard to achieve. But as the days went by, the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was stronger. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and move on their own, and every so often, I would hear that voice, just a faint whisper in the dead of night. It was taunting me, refusing to let go. The entity had found a way to stay with us, to keep its presence alive despite all our effort. And then, one night, it escalated again. I woke up to the sound of Emily crying. I rushed to her room, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door, I found her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy, he's here," she sobbed. "Edward's here. He's mad at us." I held her tightly, trying to soothe her, but my own fear was overwhelming. I could feel it too. Cold, oppressive presence in the room. It was stronger than before, more determined. "Mommy, he says we can't leave. He says we have to stay with him forever." Emily whimpered, her small body shaking with fear. I didn't know what to do. I felt utterly powerless, trapped in this endless cycle of fear and torment. I had thought we were free, that we had escaped. But the entity had followed us, binding itself to us in a way that seemed impossible to break. The next day, I confronted Robert again, desperation in my voice. "It's not gone, Robert. Still here, still with us. What do we do now?" Robert looked grim, lines on his face deepening with concern. "I was afraid of this," he admitted. "Some entities are incredibly resilient. They find a way to cling to the living, feeding off their energy. If the rituals haven't worked, there may be only one option left." "What is it?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "You may need to return to the source," Robert said slowly. "Place where it all began. Sometimes the only way to fully sever the connection is to confront the entity on its own turf." "Old house?" John asked, voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded. "Yes. The entity might be weaker now, but it's still tied to that place. If we can destroy whatever is left of its power there, it might finally be released." I felt a wave of fear and nausea wash over me. The idea of returning to that house, of facing whatever evil still lurked within its walls, was almost too much to bear. But I knew Robert was right. We had to end this once and for all. Reluctantly, John and I agreed to return to the old house. We didn't tell the children the real reason. We simply said we were going to pick up a few things we had left behind. But in truth, we were preparing for a final confrontation. As we drove back to the house, the sky darkened, heavy clouds rolling in overhead. It was as if the weather itself was warning us, urging us to turn back. There was no turning back now. We had come too far, and the only way out was through. When we arrived at the house, it was just as we had left it, silent, empty, and foreboding. The air was thick with tension as we approached the front door, the memories of our time there flooding back with each step. Robert joined us, carrying his bag of tools and supplies. He looked more serious than I had ever seen him, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet determination. "Whatever happens, stay close to me," Robert instructed. "We're going to the basement. That's where the entity's power is strongest." The house was eerily quiet as we stepped inside, floorboards creaking beneath our feet. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and I could feel the entity's presence all around us, watching, waiting. We made our way to the basement, each step filled with trepidation. The hidden room was still there, just as we had left it, the symbols on the walls now faded but still visible. The energy in the room was palpable, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to press down on us from all sides. Robert began the ritual, his voice strong and commanding as he chanted words of protection and banishment. He sprinkled salt in a circle around us, creating a barrier against the entity's power. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room deepening, and I could feel the entity's anger, its desperation. Suddenly, the room shook violently, the walls vibrating with a force that felt like an earthquake. The symbols on the walls began to glow, a sickly, unnatural light that filled the room. The entity was fighting back, its power surging as it tried to break through the barrier. "Hold on," Robert shouted. "It's trying to stop us, but we're almost there." The floor beneath us cracked, the ground splitting open as if the very foundation of the house was giving way. The room filled with a deafening roar, sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. I could see the shadows moving, swirling around us, forming into a dark, menacing figure. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room went still, the light from the symbols fading as the shadows retreated. The oppressive presence lifted, replaced by an eerie silence. "It's over," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entity is gone, for good this time." But even as he said the words, I felt a strange unease. Something wasn't right. The house was still, too still, as if holding its breath, waiting. And then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A soft, chilling whisper carried on the cold, still air. My heart froze. The entity wasn't gone. It was still here, still with us. We had failed. I turned to Robert, panic rising in my chest. "It's not over. It's still here." Robert's face paled as he realized the truth. "No, can't be." But it was. The entity was still with us, its grip on us stronger than ever. And now it was angry, more powerful than before. The house began to shake again, the walls closing in around us. The shadows returned, swirling in a frenzy, and the sickly light from the symbols flared to life once more. "We need to get out of here," John shouted, grabbing my hand. "Now!" We ran, scrambling up the basement stairs, the house collapsing around us. The walls buckled, the ceiling cracked, and debris rained down as we fought our way to the front door. The entity was tearing the house apart, its fury unleashed. We burst through the front door just as the house gave one final, deafening roar. The ground shook, and we were thrown to the ground as the house collapsed in on itself, a cloud of dust and debris rising into the air. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the dust settling around us like a shroud. I lay on the ground, my heart pounding, my mind reeling from the terror of what had just happened. Slowly, I pushed myself up, coughing as I inhaled the dust. The house was gone, reduced to rubble, nothing but a pile of debris where it had once stood. John and Robert were beside me, both of them shaken but unharmed. We looked at each other, a mixture of relief and horror on our faces. "It's over," Robert said again, but this time there was no conviction in his voice. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The entity was gone, yes, but its presence lingered, a shadow that would follow us wherever we went. We had destroyed its physical form, but its essence, its malevolent energy, was still out there, waiting, watching. As we drove away from the wreckage of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. Something unfinished. The entity had lost its home, but it had found a new one. In us. And as long as that connection remained, we would never truly be free. The nightmares returned that night, stronger than ever. The whispers were louder, more insistent, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move with a life of their own. I could feel it, even in my sleep. The entity, clinging to us, feeding off our fear, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And then one night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I heard it, clearer than ever before. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a voice, distinct and terrifying, echoing in the silence of the room. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was, a shadow, standing at the foot of the bed, watching me with hollow, empty eyes. The entity hadn't been destroyed, it had simply changed, adapted, found a new form. And now, it was stronger than ever, its power growing with each passing day. We had tried to escape, tried to fight, but in the end, it had won. The entity was part of us now, bound to us in a way that could never be broken. And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I knew that this was our fate, to live in the shadow of the entity, to be haunted by its presence for the rest of our lives. We were its prisoners, playthings, and there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. Months have passed since the collapse of the old house, but the memories are still fresh. Fear still alive. We moved again to a new town, a new house, trying once more to leave the past behind. But no matter where we go, the shadows follow. John and I rarely talk about what happened. The children have adjusted better than we have, though I catch Emily glancing at the corners of her room sometimes, as if expecting to see something lurking there. She no longer speaks of Edward, but I know she still feels his presence, as do I. Every night, as I lay in bed, I listen to the sounds of the house. Creaks, the groans, the subtle shift of shadows in the dark. I know the entity is still with us, watching, waiting for the moment to reveal itself once more. Robert checks in occasionally, though his calls have grown less frequent. There's nothing more he can do, and we both know it. The entity is part of us now, a shadow that will never fade, no matter how many rituals we perform or how far we run. And so, we live our lives as best we can, haunted by the unseen presence that lingers in the corners of our minds. The house is gone, but the entity remains, a ghost of our past that we will carry with us forever. Sometimes in the quiet moments, when the world is still and the night is dark, I think I can hear it, the faintest whisper, just at the edge of my consciousness. I close my eyes, trying to block it out, but it's always there, a reminder of what we've lost and what we can never escape. This is our life now, a life in the shadow of the entity. And though we may never see it, never feel its touch, we will always know it's there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. Because some shadows can never be banished. They become part of you, forever. The days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. We moved from one place to another, always seeking refuge, always hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But it never was. The entity followed us everywhere, a malevolent shadow that we could never escape. John and I grew distant, the stress of our constant fear driving a wedge between us. We spoke less, our conversations reduced to the bare essentials of survival. The children, once full of laughter and light, had become quiet, withdrawn. Emily no longer spoke of Edward, but her eyes held a haunted look that broke my heart. Jack, too young to understand fully, clung to me more than ever, his little hands always seeking mine for comfort. But there was no comfort to be found. Not in the new house, not in each other. The entity was always there, lurking just out of sight, its presence a constant reminder of the terror that had taken hold of our lives. The dreams continued to plague me, night after night, growing more vivid, more terrifying. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the whisper of my name still echoing in my ears. I couldn't escape it, not in sleep, not in wakefulness. It was as though the entity was burrowing deeper into my mind, slowly eroding my sanity. And then one night, everything changed. It started like any other night. We had put the children to bed, and John and I retreated to our separate corners of the house. He spent his evenings in the garage tinkering with whatever project he could find, while I sat in the living room trying to distract myself with a book or a TV show. But that night, the shadows seemed thicker, the air heavier. I could feel the entity's presence more strongly than ever before. I was about to head to bed when I heard it, the sound of Emily's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. "Mommy?" My heart skipped a beat. I knew that sound, knew it too well. It wasn't the voice of my daughter. It was a trick, a mimicry. The entity was playing with me. But still, I found myself moving towards her room, my body moving almost of its own accord. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent, the shadows seeming to close in around me. The door to Emily's room was ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a chill run down my spine. Emily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at something in the corner of the room. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. I followed her gaze, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, in the corner, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, a figure barely discernible, undeniably there. It stood motionless, watching us, its presence suffocating. And then, slowly, it began to move towards us. "Emily, get out of bed," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. She didn't move, didn't react. It was as if she was in a trance, completely unaware of the danger. "Emily," I said louder, my voice shaking, but still, she didn't respond. The shadow figure moved closer, its shape becoming more defined, more menacing. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to Emily's side, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of bed. But as soon as I touched her, the room exploded with noise. A deafening roar, like the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The walls shook, the floor trembled beneath my feet, and the shadow figure loomed over us, its form shifting and writhing as if made of smoke. I clutched Emily tightly, trying to shield her from the horror, but there was no escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The shadow figure dissolved into the air, and the room fell silent. I could hear my own ragged breathing, feel the rapid beat of my heart. Emily was trembling in my arms, her eyes wide with terror. "Mommy, he's coming for us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what to say, how to comfort her, when I was just as terrified. All I could do was hold her close, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do next. We couldn't stay here. That much was clear. The entity was growing stronger, more aggressive. It wasn't just haunting us, it was hunting us. And I knew that if we stayed, it would destroy us. I gathered Jack from his room, trying to keep my voice calm as I explained that we needed to leave. John met us at the door, his face pale and drawn. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. He knew, just as I did, we were out of time. We piled into the car, driving aimlessly through the night, desperate to put distance between us and the entity. But no matter how far we drove, I could still feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. We ended up at a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the curtains don't quite close all the way and the smell of mildew hangs in the air. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. The children fell asleep quickly, their exhaustion finally overtaking their fear. But John and I stayed awake, sitting in the darkened room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears. "What are we going to do, Claire?" John finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. We had tried everything. Rituals, cleansings, moving from place to place. Nothing worked. Entity was bound to us, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to stop this." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked older, more worn than I had ever seen him, as if the weight of our situation had aged him overnight. "We can't keep running," he said finally. "It'll find us no matter where we go. We have to face it." "Face it?" I repeated, my heart sinking. "How? We've tried everything." "There's one thing we haven't tried," John said slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "We haven't tried letting it in." I stared at him in disbelief, my mind reeling at the implication. "Can't be serious. You want to? What? Let it possess us?" "Not possess us," John corrected. "But maybe if we let it in, if we understand what it wants, we can find a way to stop it." I shook my head, fear tightening in my chest. "That's insane, John. We don't know what it's capable of. It could kill us. Or it could end this," I argued. "We've tried everything else, Claire. We have to do something." His words hung in the air, a terrible, undeniable truth. We had exhausted every option, and now we were left with nothing but desperation. But the thought of letting the entity in, of inviting it into our minds, our bodies, was almost too much to bear. But what choice did we have? "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Okay, we'll do it, but we do it together. We face it together." John nodded, his expression grim. Together. We waited until the children were fast asleep, their small bodies curled up under the thin motel blankets. Then John and I sat on the bed, facing each other, our hands clasped tightly together. "Close your eyes," John instructed, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he felt. "And focus. Invite it in." Closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to clear my mind, to open myself up to the entity, to whatever it wanted to show us. At first, there was nothing but darkness, quiet hum of the motel's air conditioner filling the silence. But then, slowly, I began to feel it. Cold, creeping presence of the entity, sliding into my consciousness like a serpent. It was subtle at first, just a faint pressure at the edge of my awareness. But as I focused, grew stronger, more insistent, pushing its way into my mind. Images flashed before my closed eyes. Dark, twisted images of the old house, of the rituals that had taken place there, of the shadowy figure that had haunted our every step. I could feel its anger, its hunger, its desperation to escape the prison it had been trapped in for so long. And then, I saw it. An image so clear, so vivid, that it took my breath away. It was a memory, but not my own. A memory of the entity, of the moment it had been bound to the house, trapped by the very man who had summoned it. I could see him now, the previous owner, standing in the hidden room, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows in the room coalesced into a single, dark form. The entity, being of pure malevolence, its power overwhelming. But as the man completed the ritual, something went wrong. The entity lashed out, its form shifting and writhing, its rage boiling over. The man screamed as the entity tore through him, but before it could escape, the ritual completed, trapping it within the walls of the house, binding it to the physical form of the heart that we had destroyed. But the destruction of the heart hadn't been enough. The entity had survived, its essence scattered but not destroyed. And now it wanted revenge. It wanted freedom. The images faded, leaving me breathless, my mind reeling from the onslaught. But I understood now. The entity wasn't just a mindless force. It was a being, with thoughts, desires, and an all-consuming need for vengeance. I opened my eyes, meeting John's gaze. I could see in his eyes that he had experienced the same vision, the same understanding. "We need to finish the ritual," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to complete what the man started." "But how?" I asked, fear tightening in my chest. "We don't know how to perform the ritual. We could make things worse." "We don't have a choice," An said firmly. "We have to try. It's the only way." The next day, we gathered everything we could find about the rituals performed by the previous owner. We scoured the journal we had found in the hidden room, looking for any clues, any hint of how to complete the ritual and banish the entity for good. Finally, we found it, a passage buried deep within the journal, detailing the final steps of the ritual, the ones that had been interrupted, leaving the entity trapped but not destroyed. It was risky, more dangerous than anything we had attempted before. But we had no choice. We had to try. We returned to the site of the old house, now nothing more than a pile of rubble and debris. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, the ground still disturbed from the collapse. The entity's presence was strong here, stronger than it had been in months, and I could feel it pressing in on us from all sides, desperate to stop us. We pressed on, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. We set up the ritual space in the center of the rubble, using the remnants of the symbols we had found in the journal. The air crackled with energy as we began to chant, words foreign and ancient, but somehow familiar. I could feel the entity's anger, its desperation, but I didn't stop. We couldn't stop. As we chanted, the ground began to shake, the earth splitting open beneath us. The shadows around us grew darker, more defined, and I could see the entity's form taking shape, rage boiling over. We continued, our voices rising above the noise, pushing back against the darkness. And then, in a final, desperate act, he completed the ritual. The air around us exploded with energy, blinding light filling the space. I felt the entity's presence surge, its power overwhelming, but then suddenly was gone. The light faded, and the world went still. We stood there, breathless, the weight of what we had done settling over us. The entity was gone, banished, destroyed, power finally severed. But as I looked at John, at the devastation around us, I knew that we would never be the same. The entity may have been defeated, but its shadow would always linger. Reminder of the darkness we had faced, battle we had fought. We returned to the motel that night, exhausted, but relieved. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, a sense that we were finally free. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Faint whisper, just at the edge of my consciousness. "Claire," I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there, just the quiet of the motel room, the sound of John's breathing beside me. It was over. The entity was gone, but the memory of it, the shadow it had cast over our lives, would never truly fade. We had won, but at a cost. We would carry the scars of this battle for the rest of our lives, always aware of the darkness that had come so close to destroying us. But we were alive. We were together. And for now, that was enough. We left the next morning, driving away from the town, from the memories, from the darkness that had haunted us for so long. We didn't speak of what had happened, didn't acknowledge the fear that still lingered in the back of our minds. But as we drove, the sun rising on a new day, I felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that we could rebuild, that we could find peace, that we could finally move on. The road stretched out before us, leading us away from the past, towards a future that was still uncertain, but filled with possibilities. And as we drove, the whisper faded, the shadows receded, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. We never returned to the town, never spoke of the house or the entity that had haunted us. We built a new life, far away from the darkness that had once consumed us. But some nights, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I still hear it. A faint whisper, a shadow at the edge of my vision. A reminder that the past, no matter how far we run, is never truly gone. But I don't fear it anymore. We faced the darkness and survived, and though the memories will always be with us, we are stronger for having endured them. Entity is gone, power broken, its shadow diminished. But the lessons it taught us, fragility of life, the strength of family, the power of love, will stay with us forever. And so we live our lives, not in fear, but in gratitude. Grateful for each day, for each moment of peace, for the light that now fills our lives. We are free. And that, above all else, is enough.